Germany is considered to be a predominantly Germanic country by most, both in a linguistic and in a cultural sense. This has been the case for Central Europe since Julius Caesar at the latest, who drew a line between a Celtic West and a Germanic East along the river Rhine and dubbed the region Germania, where modern Germany derives its name from in English, as well as in many other languages. The more astute viewers may have noticed that the river Rhine doesn't mark the border of modern Germany, however, at least not for most of its course. This shows that, contrary to the origins of the name of Germany, ancient Germania and modern Germany can't be equated because at the very least the parts of Germany that lie west of the Rhine were originally Celtic in the eyes of Caesar and other ancient authors. The same is true for the other dividing line that Caesar drew, the Danube. The Danube flows through southern Germany, and according to ancient ethnographers, it divided Central Europe into a Germanic north and a Celtic south. So the areas of modern Germany that lie south of the Danube were originally also considered Celtic. That means that western and southern Germany had not always been Germanic, but what about the rest of the country? Before Caesar divided Europe along the aforementioned rivers, the continent was considered to be generally split between northwestern Celticae and northeastern Scythia. Both of these regions were considered barbarous compared to the more civilized Mediterranean, with Greece as its beating heart. So at that time, all of what would later be known as Germania was considered Celtic. This would begin to change around the beginning of the 1st century BC, when the Greek polymath Posidonius mentioned the ancient Germans for the first time, although it is not entirely clear which population he actually described with that term, as most of Posidonius' works are now lost and only fragments remain in other ancient texts. Most modern scholars believe, however, that Posidonius only referred to a group of several groups of people living along the lower and potentially middle Rhine as Germanic. The term may have originated among the neighboring Gauls or Belgae, and was then applied to all populations across the Rhine by Caesar, when in actuality only some tribes in the west of Germania were originally described with this denomination. But although Caesar and other ancient authors generally referred to all groups between the Rhine in the west and the Vistula in the east as Germans, they at the very least differentiated between two separate groups among the Germans, sometimes more: the Western Germani and the Eastern Suebi. Some of these Western Germani, such as the Ubii, were described as very similar in culture and custom to the Gauls, whereas the people of the Suebi were seen as much more savage, even speaking a different language than their western neighbors. This implies that these groups were more different from each other originally than the grouping together under the term Germani initially implies. This would fit the archaeological record much better as well. During the 1st century BC, Central Europe could be divided roughly into two regions, and often with Celtic-speaking populations associated Latin culture in the south and west, and usually with Germanic-speaking populations associated Jastorf culture in the northeast. The area occupied by the Latin culture can be divided further into a southern Latin core and a northwestern Latin periphery. This division seems to roughly correspond to the historical records: Celtic southern Germany and a Suebian northeast. The Latin periphery in the northwest seems to have had distinct ceramics and burial customs compared to the core, making it culturally distinct enough to have been given their own name or cultural category, that is Germani, by neighboring Celtic populations. This wouldn't be anything unusual, as Gaul itself was similarly culturally divided into a Latin core, which is referred to as Gaul proper in the ancient sources, and a Latin periphery, which was inhabited by the Belgae. Interestingly enough, the Belgae are described in similar ways as the Germani across the Rhine. This would imply a relatively fluid transition from Gauls to Belgae and then to these Western Germani in the sense of Posidonius. The Belgae and the Western Germani may have been considered to be part of the same culture initially before being differentiated by Caesar due to political reasons. All of these populations may have spoken closely related or even the same language as well, although according to one theory at least, some of the Belgae and the Western Germani potentially spoke a language distinct from both Celtic and Germanic. But what's more important is that all of the aforementioned people are described as culturally related and distinct from the Suebi further to the east. Ironically, because the Western Germani probably didn't speak a Germanic language originally, and because they are culturally more similar to Celts than to the Suebi, they can probably not be seen as Germanic in our modern understanding of the term. That is, in a cultural and linguistic sense. Instead, it seems more likely that the Suebi were the original Germans, both in a sense of culture and language. For our cultural history of Germany, this means that at the time of the earliest historical records around 100 BC, Germany can be divided into a Germanic northeast, corresponding to the historical Suebi, a Celtic south, which was probably inhabited by the Helvetii in the southwest and the Boii in the southeast, and a pseudo-Germanic northwest, represented by the original Germani in Posidonius sense. From around 100 BC, major changes seem to have taken place, however. Southern Germany, before one of the core regions of the Latin culture, seems to become an abandoned wasteland between 100 BC and 50 BC. The reasons for this are unclear. Whilst some scholars believe the advance of the Roman Empire into Gaul under Julius Caesar from around 58 BC was the reason, others believe the spread of the Jastorf and the related Przeworsk culture, located to the east of the former, are to blame. Whatever the reason, from 50 BC at the latest until well into the 1st century AD, there's barely any archaeological material to be found in southern Germany. What little material there is predominantly points to the northeast, to the Jastorf culture. This has been interpreted with a spread of Germanic populations into the south. This expansion can also be observed in the northwest, but contrary to the developments in the south, the local Latin culture doesn't disappear suddenly. Instead, it merges with influences from the Jastorf culture to form the so-called Rhine-Weser-Germanic culture during the 1st century AD. It is believed that only during this time, which coincided with the attempts of the Roman conquest of Germania, the region was gradually Germanized. By the end of the 1st century AD, the areas east of the Rhine and north of the Danube had probably actually become predominantly Germanic in both language and culture. The areas to the south and west were incorporated into the Roman Empire, and there the so-called Gallo-Roman culture emerged, characterized by a mix of local Celtic and imported Roman cultural aspects, which were especially apparent in architecture, but also in religion and language, among other areas. Some of the areas west of the Rhine would also gradually become Germanic over the following centuries, mostly due to Roman authorities settling German tribes on the banks of the river to protect the border of the empire. From the 3rd century onwards, this process was sped up by the decline of the Roman Empire, coinciding with the fall of the southern German limes. Some of the areas south of the Danube now also became Germanic in a process that lasted well into the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, in the northeast, from the 6th century onwards, Germanic settlements and graveyards seemed to disappear, similarly to what had been observed in southern Germany half a millennium earlier with the Latin culture. It seems that many of the people from these former core areas of the Germanic peoples now settled in southern Germania and beyond. At the same time, people from the east started moving into the largely abandoned regions in northeastern Germania. It is now believed that these groups were early Slavic settlers, and most of modern eastern Germany became Slavic in the process. This would remain to be the case up until the High Middle Ages, when Germans gradually began to resettle the area and subsequently other parts of East Central and Eastern Europe. Genetic data indicates that a large proportion of the local Slavs were assimilated into the culture of these Germans, making modern East Germans partially Slavic in ancestry. To this day, there's a small Slavic-speaking minority to be found in Eastern Germany. Following World War II, most of the Germans that had settled in Eastern Europe in the centuries prior were forced to return to Germany or Austria in what has been described as one of the greatest acts of ethnic cleansing in European history, potentially world history. They were subsequently integrated into the societies of modern Germany and Austria. This was the last great migration of people into the area of modern Germany, and with that, this short cultural history of Germany has come to an end. If you liked what you saw, please consider leaving a like and subscribing. It would help me a lot in trying to build this channel up to a point where I can potentially help fund my PhD with it. If there's anything important that I forgot, let me know in the comments below. And lastly, I'd like to thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, have a good one.